Colour washing your crepe paper is one of the easiest ways to make it look more realistic. So let me show you how to do it. Most crepe paper only comes in a limited number of colours. Some of the ranges, like the Italian for example, do have a lot more colour options, but you're still limited to somebody else's colour palette. In reality, flowers don't come in one shade or a flat colour. Each one is slightly different, and colours can change quite dramatically from one side of the petal to another. And even a single petal can look completely different to its neighbour. So instead of just using crepe paper straight from the roll, an easy way to add more variety and movement to your paper flowers is to use colour washing. There's a few different ways that you can do it. You can paint a whole sheet of paper in just one colour. You can play with gradients and ombre effects. You can mix several colours over the width of your paper, or you can colour individual petals to give you more control over where the colour is applied. You can also experiment with different paints and inks to create your dye. Today I wanted to quickly show you how I used alcohol inks on the paper anemones that I made recently. So some of them used a full colour wash just to change the colour of the paper, and then others I actually went in and added more of an ombre effect over the top as well. For each one I started out with the same paper anemone design, but you can see that the results are all really different from one another, just like in nature. I have a free template and tutorial for you, which I will link if you want to give it a try. Start by mixing your alcohol inks in a jar. So I'm using Purple Twilight, Raspberry and Amethyst, and these are all the Tim Holtz collection by Ranger. So I'll put the number of drops that I'm using in the description box below, so if you want to replicate this you can. And then I also added 10 ml of isopropyl alcohol to water that down slightly. And then for a full colour wash, all you have to do is brush that mix over the entire paper. So this one's quite an easy one to do. And this paper that I'm starting with is the Griffith German Crepe, the heavyweight in raspberry. So you can either do this with a full sheet of paper or a square, just as I'm doing here, or you can cut your petal out first and then cover the exact size of paper that you need. So a couple of things to note here. Obviously cover your workspace before you get started. So I like to use cling film for this. So you can see that I've got that stretched out across my workspace, and that just gives you a nice waterproof layer. And then also you can do this either more subtly like I'm doing here, or you can create quite a dramatic colour change if you want to. So to do that, just add more drops of alcohol and less isopropyl. So the more isopropyl that you add, the more it will water it down and the colour won't be as dark. So you can really play with different techniques and figure out what kind of depth of colour you want here. The second method that you can use is to create a gradient. So to do that, I'm going to show you the same technique on two different colours of paper. So this is using the Leo Griffith Heavyweight German Crepe, and the one on the left is aubergine and the one on the right is plum. But the inks and everything that I apply to them both is going to be exactly the same. So you'll see the finished result, what a difference the paper can make. So obviously if you start with a white sheet of paper, for example, that will give you a very different result than if you start with purple or any other colour. So you can really play with different starting colours, different papers, different inks, all of the different combinations. So for our gradient, we're going to start by covering the paper with just isopropyl. No ink, just the isopropyl to get the paper wet. And then next you need to mix your dye. So for both of these, I'm using Indigo and Cool Perry, and again these are Tim Holtz by Ranger, and I'll put the quantities that I'm using in the description box below. Give that a good mix, and then we're literally just going to dab those onto the petal. So if you want the gradient to be darker at the base of the petal, like I'm doing here, just dab them on at the bottom of the petal. And you can actually do this the other way around as well. So you could just do it at the other end of the petal so that it goes darker to lighter. So if you want like a lighter center, for example. And you can just keep dabbing that on and you'll see that the ink starts to slowly work its way up the petal. And that's because we've already wet it with the isopropyl. So what I like to do is do a little bit and then leave it to dry for maybe 5 minutes or so and then do a bit more. And that really increases the intensity of the colour. So if you want something a little bit more dramatic, that's the way to do it. You need to be careful to not oversaturate the paper. If you put too much on in one go, sometimes you end up with a line where the ink's dried. So just do it gradually and just do a little bit at a time. And actually if you're doing a batch of petals, so probably you'll be doing the full flower in one go. By the time you've done the first one and then moved all the way through all the petals, you can probably go back and start again on the first one because it does take a little bit of time anyway. The other thing I would say here is also it's best to do this on a pre-cut petal rather than a sheet of paper, because then you get the ink in the place that you want on the petal. Otherwise, you'll just end up with like a generic gradient and they might not be in the right place. You could still do that technique if that's what you're looking for, but if you're looking for a darker centre to your flower, this is the way to do it. And then I also wanted to show you another option for this. So I'm going to do exactly the same technique, but I'm going to use 2 different layers of colour. So I'm using red pepper and indigo. I didn't water that down at all because I wanted quite an intense colour. And then because I'm using quite a light colour of paper, it gives an even more intense effect. So this paper is the Leah Griffith Heavyweight in Blush. So again, I'm doing the same technique, just dabbing it onto the bottom of the petal. And because we've got this contrast between the ink and the paper, you can really see how the ink moves up the petal here. So this is a good one to explain it as well. So I let that dry a little bit, maybe about 10 or 15 minutes, but I wanted to make sure the paper was still wet. So just keep an eye on it. It obviously depends on the temperature of your room, how quickly that will dry. So just keep an eye on it until it looks like it's starting to dry slightly, but it's still wet enough to work with. So I just went back in with another layer in Cool Perry, which really helped to tone down the colour here. And you can do this, if you wanted it to be more intense, you could use a darker colour, or you can do the lighter version like I've done here. But again, there's so many different techniques that you can play with here, just depending on which colour combinations that you use. But you can definitely layer it up. So you could do more than 2 layers as well. Just make sure to leave a little bit of time in between for them to dry. And keep an eye on how wet the actual petal is getting. So the other method that you can try is basically layering the 2 options together. So you can start with a full colour wash in a coloured ink, and then also go in with a gradient at one end as well. So the technique is exactly the same as we've done with the other 2 methods. So I'm starting here with a layer which combines Purple Twilight, Raspberry and Amethyst. And I've mixed that with 10 ml of isopropyl alcohol. And the paper that I'm using is the same blush as before. So I'm just going to mix those together and then paint a layer over the paper. And again, we're doing the full colour wash here. And then the next step is to clean out your jar so you've got a fresh start, and then to mix another colour. So you probably want to go a bit darker with the second colour. So for this one, I'm using the same 3 colours, but I'm using more drops. So for example, with the first layer, I used 4 drops of the Purple Twilight. With this one, I'm using 10. And then also for the second layer, I used less isopropyl so that it was more of an intense colour. And then I also added a few extra drops so that I could do this detail at the very top of the petal, which was even more intense. So you can play with different combinations to get that colour that you want, but by using the same 3 ingredients, it kind of helps to tie them together as well. I hope you found that useful and that I've inspired you to give colour washing a try. If you have any questions, then drop them in the comment box below and I'll do my best to help. Stay tuned for the next instalment of my paper anemone colouring series coming very soon. I'll be showing you a few different ways to colour your leaves and your stems, so make sure that you subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss when that video goes live. But until then, happy flower making!